actually blow through there, create some air to create our object. Then we have our reheating chamber. So you'll notice when Sandy starts pulling material out of our furnace, it's going to cool down pretty rapidly. So we can bring it on in here and bring it all the way back up to working temperature. And then our final piece of equipment that we'll talk about is our bench. This is where Sandy's going to work and get all of his stuff done. There are some glass blowing studios where they'll work standing. You'll often see that in factories and that kind of thing. But this is already tough enough on our bodies, so we want to make it as easy as possible. So this is Sandy's bench. That's his tool deck. That's where he'll keep all of his tools. And that's sort of my pre-ramble. If we want to go ahead and get started. So Sandy's going to go ahead and grab that blowpipe. He's blowing through it to make sure it doesn't have any clogs. And he's going to go ahead and he's going to grab our first gather of glass. So we think of glass as this hard object. But in actuality, we have this nice flow to it. So Sandy's going to come on over to our pipe cooler. That's one of our objects that I forgot to talk about. Our pipe cooler is going to cool our pipes down, so that way we can have a nice width of grip. So you'll see Sandy holds it pretty wide across the pipe. If we let it get too hot and he has to grab towards the tip, he actually isn't going to have any control over the material. Glass more and more, it's going to get harder and harder for Sandy to get air in there. So we're going to let that set up a little bit. If Sandy goes back in there too early, this glass is going to heat up too quickly and it's going to cause our bubble to collapse a little bit, which means Sandy will have to basically restart. So it's a little easier just to wait a second, let it chill out, let it set up. You can already tell it's an entirely different state of matter than when we pull it fresh out of the furnace. Sandy can bang it right there on the table. So Sandy's going to take another dip. I'm guessing he's going to do like 2.5 maybe. And you'll notice every time our glass basically doubles in size. So for Sandy to gather up enough glass to make an object, he's going to have to turn faster than is actually humanly possible. So we're going to start working in layers. So we have our bubble layer, and then we have our nice fresh gather layer. I'm handing Sandy our nice wooden block tool. A lot of our tools are made out of stainless steel. Everything in here has to be able to withstand large amounts of heat. These are made out of fruit wood, so they have a really tight grain pattern. So when we're working in here, heat's sort of the name of the game, right? The hottest the glass ever is when it comes fresh out of the furnace. But if we use our stainless steel tools, that's going to suck a lot of that heat out really rapidly, and it's going to cause the glass to cool down. So our wooden block tool is really great because it's not sucking a lot of heat out, but it's doing a really great job of shaping up our glass. And all of those tools most of our wooden tools stay waterlogged. There's one paddle that we'll talk about later. But that's so that it actually creates a steam barrier. It's never actually touching the glass. This is that same effect where if you have a really hot pan on your stove and you throw a little bit of water on there, it dances around a little bit. It's called the Leidenfrost effect. It's that nice steam barrier. So Sandy's got that shaped up. He's got the heat evened out in his layers. He's going to introduce a little bit more air. Then I think he's going to get one more gather on top of this. Right now, Sandy has enough glass to maybe make like a nice cup, maybe a small bowl, but I know he wants a little bit more. So we're going to let that set up a little bit. Sandy can give you a nice visual of our bubble. You'll notice he has that nice amount of thickness on the bottom. And when we're blowing into the glass, the air naturally wants to go where the glass is the hottest. So the tip is the first thing that goes in the reheating chamber and the last thing that comes out. So that's naturally where the air wants to go. So Sandy's done a little bit of work to really reinforce that bottom, which will help us out later on. This is sort of the waiting part. You'll see it sort of is starting to go back to that nice clear that we're familiar with glass. But when we're working in here, we always want it to have a little bit of a yellowish hue. Otherwise, we have to start worrying about it getting too cold. Now Sandy's gonna come on out. Now he's got a good amount of glass. So we're gonna block this one more time, even out our layers of heat a little bit. Sandy's gonna put some frit on the outside, which I can show you guys really quick. There's a couple different ways that we can get glass color onto the glass, and this is sort of our easiest way. This is called frit. So you can see all those teeny tiny chunks. Sandy's working with an orange glass today, which is fun. But this is what frit looks like normally. So it's got this nice sandy sort of look. Some people call them like sprinkles or jimmies. And this is just crushed up colored glass. So how we get the color in the glass is it doesn't really work like paint color. We can't just throw pigment in there and boom, the glass is blue. Everything has to be done chemically. So orange is a really complicated color to make. That's where it gets like super chemical. But if we look at a color like blue, there's this very famous type of glass called cobalt blue. So you can take raw cobalt, throw a little bit in with our clear glass, and it'll turn that whole tank blue. But if you take that blue and you mix it with white, it's not really going to make light blue. Most of the time it turns out brown. So you got a little bit crafty. So if Sandy wanted to make this multicolored, he would put a layer of clear glass in between. But today we're going for a nice orange. So Sandy will probably do a couple different coats. And we get all of our glass color from different manufacturers around the world. We could theoretically melt our own glass color here, but this is a public access studio. So there's somewhere between 20 to 30 artists that use our tanks here. So to have colorless as an option is really great. And then you can purchase all different types of colored glass from 3 different companies. But that's where it sort of limits your color palette. So really, artists with really large glass studios will mix their own color, like Lino mixes his own color. So that way he can have a really custom application. But a lot of those color recipes are kept really, really secret. Back from when glass was mainly a factory activity, glass factories would keep their recipes super, super secret just because that was their livelihood. If Libby was the only one who knew how to make a beautiful purple glass, they would keep that recipe as long as they could, just so that they could be the one with the purple. So Sandy's starting to inflate a little bit. Sandy's rolling his glass across what's called our marver, so that little stainless steel table. And the word marver comes from sort of the Latin root word for marble. So back in the Roman days, those would have been a large slab of marble. But marble is A, really expensive, and B, really fragile. So if you ever dropped it, it would shatter into a million pieces. So thankfully, we live in the future. So we have nice stainless steel. And stainless steel is a lot of our tools, but what's really great about it is it has this zigzag pattern, like molecularly. So all of the zigzags absorb all of that heat. So even as Sandy rolls across the marver, I could stick my hand right behind the glass and we won't feel any of that heat. So what Sandy's doing right now is he's inflating our shoulder. And you'll hear me talk about the bubble sort of like a body. The part that's closest to the pipe is our neck. If we were pulling out a bottle or something, that's where the neck would go. And then just below that is our shoulder, which is going to end up being the top of our object. So Sandy wants to puff that out nice and thin while leaving a lot of thickness on the bottom. Just because if you've ever drank it out of a glass cup, which I'm sure everyone has, if you have a really thick lip, it feels really uncomfortable on your mouth. And if your bottom is really thin, the object can really easily break or fall over and shatter into a million pieces. So when you first start blowing glass, you sort of learn how to make sure your piece is nice and bottom weighted. So that way we don't have to worry about anything toppling over. Sandy's rolling across our marver. He's giving it that nice point. The angle that he's working out is what's really doing all of the work. Sandy doesn't have to push super hard. That material is so molten at this point that you have to be really, really gentle with it. Sandy's giving you a nice view of the bubble. So Sandy's gonna heat that up pretty gooey. You can see how much we have to go in and out of the reheating chamber. So as soon as we come out of the furnace, that thing starts to set up quite a bit. So it's sort of up and down and up and down and up and down. Never a dull moment. Sandy's gonna give it one more marver, really reinforce that bottom weight. This is gonna help us out later on, and what we like to say is that glass has a memory. So every time we touch it to a tool, or every time we sort of mess with it or touch it with the marver, that glass is gonna remember that later on. So Sandy's putting all this memory in there now, so that way we can use it to our advantage. And we got all that thickness nice on the bottom. So now Sandy's gonna get ready to put on our constriction line. This is sort of the basis of glass blowing, right? Nothing in the museum has a pipe stuck to the end of it. So we're gonna take our jacks, which is sort of our iconic glass blower tool, and we're gonna put in a little constriction point, and that's gonna tell us the glass where we want it to break off of the pipe. So Sandy's coming on with our jacks, and you'll notice he's pushing pretty gently. If he goes in and he just squeezes really, really hard, it's gonna cause that line to come out flat. And we want it nice and round. So Sandy's gonna start out gentle, and then as it sort of starts to set up, we can squeeze a little bit more. So Sandy's gonna give it a little bit more heat. This is where it gets tricky, especially with orange glass. Orange is my least favorite color of glass, because orange is a really stiff color, which means you have to heat it up quite a bit before it really starts to want to move. And then it can either hold that heat or it can cool down pretty rapidly if you don't get it like crazy, crazy hot. It's a huge pain. But Sandy likes pain. Oh, Sandy's pulled out a lovely bottleneck. So you can sort of start to see that a little bit. So I know Sandy's making a vase, so he's going to use that a little bit later on. You just saw Sandy's jacks flare up a little bit. Just our jacks are lubricated with beeswax. So you'll notice Sandy has to turn a lot. He wants it to be nice and smooth. So that uses that little bit of lubrication, and that can catch on fire sometimes. But when you start working in here, you sort of have to become immune to fire. So it doesn't really scare any of us anymore. Sort of just part of the deal. Once Sandy's got his neck nice and on center, now we can sort of sew and start working on the bottom of our bubble. So Sandy's not going to get that neck crazy hot at this point. You'll notice when we go in the reheating chamber, the part that's the narrowest is going to heat up the most. So if Sandy lets that jack line get really, really hot, it's going to be really, really difficult to turn just because it's flopping all over the place. You want a door, Sandy?
No, it's fine.
Okay. So Sandy's going to heat up the bubble, the more bulbous part. And then we can start to really shape up our glass. So this is actually, we're working from the top down. So normally in ceramics, you know, you throw a pot, you work from the bottom up. But in here, we have to work from the top of our vessel all the way to the bottom. And then we'll flip it around to do some final touches. So Sandy's got some nice heat. Now you can really see the difference in the color. So it's pretty brown up top. I know I said it was orange, but I promise you it'll go back to normal once it's out of the annealer. When our glass color comes out, when it comes out cold, it's going to look totally different from when it's hot. So I can show you guys the nice orange Sandy's working with. I bet it's not too hot anymore. This is a fun thing. So you can see our lovely orange. Very pumpkin-y. That is the same color as this lovely brown that Sandy has going on the pipe. Sandy's using a little bit of gravity to thin out the walls of his bubble. So since he has that nice thickness on the bottom, what he can do is physically let gravity pull down on the sides. And that's going to elongate it so that it's a nice long bottle, but also thin out the sides of our walls. Sandy's putting a little bit of a waste in there. This is something you commonly see in like a Pilsner glass or like certain types of specialty bottles. It gives you a little bit more control over what you're making.
Alright, could you please attach the blow hose?
Oh yeah. So Sandy has this lovely blow hose that I'm going to help him hook up. Normally you would see us working a little bit more closely, but we've had to adapt a little bit. Here you go. So Sandy basically has a piece of surgical tubing attached to the end of his pipe that allows him to blow into and sort of change shape a little bit. So now Sandy's got his bottom nice and hot. He's got his blow hose hooked up. And he can sort of go ahead and start to change the shape of his bubble a little bit. So when he's blowing very gently. If Sandy, it's sort of like a balloon. If Sandy blows really, really hard and that glass is really hot, it's going to actually pop the bottom of that bubble. So he's blowing pretty gently, going ahead and giving things a little shape. I'll grab a paddle for you, Sandy. So this is one of our other wooden tools. It's made out of that same fruit wood the blocks are. So you'll notice Sandy is just heating the face of that bubble. If at any point we let that neckline get too hot and we start to inflate and change the bottom, it's going to totally change the profile of the vase. So Sandy's going to blow pretty gently. I'm here with a paddle. And we're going to start to use our Jackson paddle like a mold to change the shape of the base of our vase. And I'm not pushing crazy hard. The glass is still pretty molten at this point. As it starts to set up, I can push harder and harder. And you'll notice this is where it's really important, because since it's a glass object, we have to make sure it makes really nice contact with the table that it's sitting on. So you saw Sandy give it a little bit of a push in, so that way it has a nice ring on the inside. You want to do that one more time? No, it's fine. It's fine? Okay. We're going to let this set up a little bit. You'll notice if you pick up like a wine or a soda bottle, it'll have that nice ring on the bottom. That's to ensure that we make really, really great contact with the table. So Sandy's going to touch that up a little bit, make everything nice and even. And then I'm going to make Sandy something called a punty. Oh yeah, we can do a patch. So we're going to put a patch on the bottom of this, which is just a little nub of glass. So that way Sandy can stamp our stamp in later. You ready? So I'm just going to bring Sandy a nice single gather. Sandy can go ahead and stick me on the bottom. And the cool thing about hot glass is that we don't actually have to cut it. It's so elastic that I can pull and stretch it. And that we can stretch it thin enough to just break it off. So that little patch is just going to add a little bit of stability. It's going to let us know where we want to stick our punty on. Sort of extra little bit of insurance. And you can see that bright hot glass. The best thing about working with hot glass is that it fuses to itself really, really nicely. So we don't have to do any sort of prep work. We don't have to preheat anything. As long as everything's warm enough, we can just stick pieces together, no problem. Ready? Okay, so I'm going to make Sandy something called the punty. And this is going to allow us to actually transfer the bottle over and open up the top. So how a lot of commercially made cups are made, you can just sort of knock it off of the blowpipe now, let it cool down, cut off the top and polish it. But in here we want to have a little bit more control than that. So we're going to go ahead and punty this bad boy and open her up. I'm making sure my pipe's nice and warm. Sorry, Sandy, I'm going to give it a little more.
I need to boost heat in the oil. So
That sounds great. We got nothing but time. All right, I'm good. So I just have one small gather of glass. So this is the part where I get quiet because I have to pay attention. Okay, that's pretty good. So I'm going to cool this down so that way we can handle it nice and wide. When you're holding the pipe, you got to sort of hold it like a hockey stick. You want a nice width. Sandy's going to give it one more flash. I'm going to give this a little bit of heat. I always make these too hot. Sandy can go ahead and stick me on. Oh, that's not bad.
how you feel?
I can take that. Sandy's going to use a couple drops of water. He's going to go all the way up to that constriction line. Then he can give it a good tap. And then I'm going to go ahead and give it a nice flash. So this heat is just to sort of make sure nothing cracks, right? We want to make sure everything's nice and happy. It was just cold enough for us to physically break it like room temperature glass. But now we got to take it all the way back up to molten. So what Sandy's going to do right now is he's going to make any sort of little adjustments. When you're taking a pottery class and you throw your first pot, you know, you have to center the clay. This is sort of that part. If we ever stick our punty on super off center and we start to open our bottle up, you can totally see the neck come out crooked. So we gotta be careful and even. So Sandy's gonna heat up the front of that bottle, get everything nice and gooey. This is sort of our longest reheat, right? Because we were just cold enough to break it like glass. But now we have to get it all the way back up to that super gooey temperature. So this is the part where we sit and we wait and we relax. Normally Sandy and I are up and down, but this is the nice chill part. It can get challenging once you're up at the reheating chamber and you have to start opening those doors up. That's when it can start to get really, really hot. So this is no problem for two people. If we were to go 1 or 2 gathers bigger, that's when you sort of want to start having a third person, whether it's to blow or open the doors or just help out in any way. Normally this is very much a team sport, but these days we've had to lax up on the team a little bit. So Sandy's gonna go ahead and he's gonna grab his tweezers, which are basically like your household tweezers, just large and stainless steel. And he's gonna pinch and he's gonna make himself a nice little handle. So remember when we're blowing and how the air naturally wants to go towards the tip? That sort of works against our favor right now. So what Sandy's doing is he's pinching and pulling and elongating that out, making sure it's nice and thin. So what we're gonna do is Sandy has that little pinch, right? That little handle. That's called a floret. And some people like that. Some people use that very purposefully in their aesthetic. But if I know Sandy, he's not a huge fan. So we're actually gonna trim this off. So Sandy's got a nice pair of shears. These are exactly like regular scissors, just basically big and stainless steel. And Sandy can physically cut the excess that he wants off. That's tough to do with bottles, Sandy. He told me he was going to trim before we started, but I forgot we were making a bottle. So Sandy's got that extra little nub, but he can cut that off, no problem. Especially once you start reheating, you'll notice it had that really deep white shear mark. All of that's going to melt out as we start to work with it. So it's not really something you have to worry about. haven't had to trim anything in a very long time. Sandy will get that little nub. There's no problem. So theoretically, Sandy can do that over and over again until you stretch this whole bottle out into a weird tube. Glass is sort of infinitely elastic when it's hot. So we can pull and pull and pull, and I could basically, if we got this thing hot enough, Sandy could stay on his end of the pipe. I could grab those shears and grab one end of the pipe, and we could stretch that glass. I could go all the way to the main museum, Sandy could go all the way to our parking lot, and it'll just keep going and going and going. Now we're gonna go back on with our jacks. Sort of even out the top, change the shape in any way that Sandy wants. I'm ready for him with a paddle.
The next one.
Okay, we're gonna do it on the next heat. We're gonna use the paddle in the same way that we did with the bottom. We're just gonna even that out and sort of use it like a mold. So we'll do that one more time, and you'll start to notice Sandy's going to sort of change the profile of his jacks. So that tool deck's all of the space that we have in order to make everything that we do in here. So all of our tools have to be really, really versatile. So you'll notice Sandy will sort of start to raise the angle of his jacks a little bit. And then he can sort of very lightly flare out the top of our object. And you'll think, oh, Sandy's right hand's the one with the tool. It must be the one doing all the work. But you'll notice if you look at his left hand, it's the one doing all of the turning. And that's really sort of all of the power. You want to do one more? Okay. We're going to do one more to touch it up. Make it nice and even. Sandy's going for a little bit of a feathering. This is where it can get really hard because Sandy wants to get that front nice and hot. But since that neck is so short now and nice and wide, you can sort of start to have the shoulder of your object change a little bit if you get it too hot. Sandy's doing a little bit of a feather just to make sure everything stays nice. We're going a little steeper. And we can come on the outside. I'm going to come on with my paddle. That way we can keep everything nice and even. Very nice. So if we were to leave this just out in room temperature air, it's going to really quickly start cracking and breaking. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start flashing it down. And right now it's maybe in the like 14 to 1200 range. You can see a little bit of the heat difference in the front and the back. So we want to get it down so that we can take it off safely. So Sandy's going to take a few flashes. Do you want a map gas, Sandy? And we're going to add a little bit of heat to this punty. That way we can sort of get it off the pipe nicely. It's running low. So Sandy's just taking these nice quick heats, sort of reintroducing some heat into that punty before we can take this thing off. I'm going to go ahead and put on my super cool outfit. That way we can load this piece into our annealing oven. So we're going to cool it down slowly over time. That way it stays nice and stable and we don't have to worry about it cracking or breaking. So I have a nice I have a nice welding jacket, a pair of Kevlar gloves that I'm going to put a little bit of heat on. Because even my room temperature gloves can be enough to sort of send a crack right through that glass. Oh yeah, there we got a little movement. So now we know we're about ready. So Sandy's gonna go ahead and give it a couple more flashes, and then we'll head on over to our knockoff table. And what Sandy's gonna do is he's gonna put a little bit of water at the connection point where the punty meets the bottom of our object. And that's gonna allow us to break this off nicely. So Sandy's got a lovely butter knife, which lets him get all the way up in there. I'm gonna support it, give it a good tap. Classic, it's okay. This is sort of a annealing temperature for glass. So basically, this is where all of the stress can come out of the material, right? Because we just made it really, really hot and really, really cold in the same span of an hour. So this is going to cool down for about 24 hours. The thickest part of it is that bottom part. So it's maybe 1/2 of an inch if we're pushing it. If you look in our ancient gallery, we have that large cast bench. That sits at about this wide across at its widest point. So that annealed for about 11 months. So when we're annealing glass, we want to make sure it cools down nice and evenly, and we can have that come out tomorrow. If you guys have any questions, you can go ahead and leave them in the comments. And if you're watching in the future, we can go ahead and respond to you, because these will be up forever. Starting next week, we are going to go back to doing our in-person demonstrations. So we have our mobile unit out in the courtyard that you guys can come into the museum and visit us. The galleries are open Wednesday through Sunday, every day. The hours change daily, so go ahead and look at them on the website. And of course, we'd like to thank our sponsors, Owens, Illinois, and Welltower for sponsoring all of our demonstrations. And I think that's about it. So if you guys have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments. We'll answer them in the future. Other than that, thank you guys for watching.